our last talk of the session is on reliability of assessment and the use of rubrics to assess writing in a linguistic classroom by Daniel Ozerny. And we're sorry that you had to join us remotely, but we're glad you're here. So go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about this, and I'm glad to be presenting on this topic. So I'm very grateful for this venue, because I don't think there's enough discussion of scholarly teaching generally, but from my particular issue, assessment is really under discussed, I feel, and so I hope that this slide, or other outline of slides, will be helpful. So the purpose of this presentation is threefold. The primary is to familiarize scholarly teachers, that is yourself, with concepts of reliability and validity, and specifically argument validity, for example, as developed by Carol Chappell at Iowa State and her colleagues, as they relate to assessing writing. Consider a few rubrics taken from existing courses or exams, and discuss the potential reliability problems. So we'll look at several rubrics, but rubric is a very general sort of term. We'll look at, why they might be not very suitable to use in a modern linguistic classroom. And this is, I want to emphasize, not confined to linguistics. So this is just, writing assessment in general. And for practicing teachers, I want to suggest some strategies to increase reliability. And the general, so spoiler sort of here, the general suggestion will be to be very specific about what you are assessing exactly. So the problem is, alarmingly, it seems that the researchers, teachers across departments, and this is humanities, STEM, anywhere, are oblivious that there isn't a field whose purpose is investigating language assessment, and that is a psychometric field, very rigorous statistically, and so on. Routinely, the field is overlooked, and there are research papers in the journal Assessing Writing which say that when teachers use self-designed rubric, teachers without training in language assessment, the reliability of assessment actually decreases as compared to when they don't use a rubric. And so rubrics which are designed without much thought, or rubrics that are designed without training, can actually decrease reliability of assessment, and thereby harm the students, right, the learning process. I aim to claim that overlooking language assessment makes assessment across many classrooms equivalent to assigning random numbers. Essentially, that's what is happening. So now let's talk about validity and what validity is. The argument-based validity framework is simple and involves two steps. First, one needs to specify the proposed interpretations and uses of the scores in some detail. And second, there's need to evaluate the overall plausibility of the proposed interpretation and uses. And this is very intuitive, right? You propose an assessment and you say, hey, this assessment gives this score, and there is this empirical connection between the score and its interpretation. Interpretive argument specifies the proposed interpretations and uses of assessment results by laying out a network of inferences and assumptions leading from the observed performances to the conclusions and decisions based on the assessment scores. Let's move to reliability. Reliability is essentially consistency. So statistically, inter-rater reliability, inter-rater, inter and intra. So between raters and within one rater. So when I am grading, let's say, essays or scores of my students, I have to assign them scores in a consistent way. So I have to treat everybody the same. And if there are several people grading, like several TAs grading, they have to assign scores which are uniform, which are not uniform in some vague sense, but which are statistically uniform. So it's a statistical measure. It's not a vague measure that the numbers are identical. It's a measure that there is certain threshold, certain margin of error definitely exists, but it has to be statistically reliable. Sometimes reliability is viewed as separate from validity in early tradition, and sometimes as a daughter notion or a type of validity evidence. So if the assessment is, if the scores are reliable, then the assessment is valid. So I will treat them separately in this presentation, and know that the validity applies to tests and reliability to scores. So the tests can be valid and the scores can be reliable, right? this is a description of validity, another one which I want us to consider, and this is from a recent colloquium organized by me and several colleagues at AAAL, where we talked about a very adjacent problem that in language acquisition studies, when people claim to test language proficiency, they might just give a placement test or ABCD test, and that has nothing to do with a language assessment. So this is not limited to the classroom. This is a very ubiquitous problem. So validity is an integrated evaluative judgment of the degree to which empirical evidence and theoretical rationale support the adequacy and appropriateness of inferences and actions based on test scores, right? So there is this tight connection to the inference. There are certain inferences made when you look at the score, whether it's a 100 or an 80, and that inference has to be adequate. You have to have empirical justification of that inference. As such, validity is an inductive summary of both the existing evidence for and potential consequences of test score interpretation and use. Hence, what is to be validated is not the test as such, but the inferences derived from test scores. And it is suggested, I suggest, that every scholarly teacher engages in this process of validation of the rubrics which they themselves devise, right? Inferences about the score meaning or interpretation and about the implications for action that interpretation entails. It's important that validity is a matter of degree, not all or none, right? So in a sense, like grammaticality could be considered a gradient by some traditions, validity is also a matter of degree. Furthermore, over the time, the existing validity evidence becomes enhanced by new findings, and projections of potential social consequence of testing became transformed by evidence of actual consequences and by changing social conditions. It is important to understand that validity is not something that is universal, and a test can just have a stamp that it is valid and no objections can be posed to it. No, it is very, very contextual. So a rubric that is appropriate for one classroom might not necessarily be appropriate for a different one. A test that is appropriate in certain cases might not be appropriate in the other ones, and so validity changes respectively. And of course, yeah, validity is an evolving property, and validation is a continuing process so hence the tests evolve. Since evidence is always incomplete, validation is essentially a matter of making the most reasonable case to guide both current use of the test and current research to advance understanding of what the test scores mean. Now, the test scores, the takeaway from that big, rather complicated slide with all the terminology is that the scores should be reliable, the test should be valid. The scores should be reproducible, and the connection between the interpretation of the score and the actual test should be clearly and empirically shown. When I'm saying a test, I'm not implying a test and multiple choice test or fill the blank test. A test could be of a productive ability, such as speaking or writing. And I focus on writing specifically here, but speaking is another very similar. So what I'm saying here can be easily extended into speaking, albeit I don't think that there are a lot of speaking assessments out there in the linguistic classroom today, unless it's the TESOL classroom, but that's a very different topic. So for example, TOEFL, even though I said TOEFL to a very different topic, but TOEFL never doesn't assess general language proficiency, has very specific interpretation and use. No multiple choice test can assess language proficiency generally, and so no multiple choice test can assess the learning progress in a linguistic classroom in the same manner, because language proficiency at a minimum includes reading, writing, listening, speaking, but there's much more complicated framework behind that, and those interested should consult Council Europe 2020 companion volume to the CFR. And in the same way, learning in linguistic classroom involves acquiring multiple competencies across a number of levels, not just memorizing facts, right? And so in the same way, this one particular assessment cannot, multiple choice cannot assess this overall, pretty much anything, overall proficiency, overall competency, and so on. Now let's consider real life examples. And I start with a good rubric from a C2 proficiency exam, which is for English as second language, but those are the biggest exams, they're standardized. And I want to really focus on that rubric for a minute to see how specific the descriptors are. And then we compare it to the two other existing rubrics, which I have seen in the classroom, or various classrooms across the country. So the writing rubric here consists of 4 subscales: content, communicative achievement, organization, and language. And we can just take a look at, for example, the band 5. For content, the judgment is that all content is relevant to the task, and the task can be, for example, write a review of a book of 250 words. Thank you very much. Target reader is fully informed. Then communicative achievement is demonstrating command of conventions of the communicative task, communicating complex ideas effective and convincing way, holding the target's reader's attention, etc., etc. So let's look at skip organization, look at language. Uses a wide range of vocabulary, less common lexis, fluency, precision, sophistication, and style. And so if we just take this, just these descriptors, that's a very bad rubric, because what is relevancy to the task, what is being informed, what is wide range of vocabulary, there are no specifications of those qualifiers, right? So we have this definition, uses a wide range of vocabulary, but what is wide range of vocabulary? What is conventions of the communicative task? And inevitably the people who rate, who assign scores to the essays, they have all of these glossaries with extensive definitions of what they mean when they say basic vocabulary or target reader, or what they mean by saying relevant information, right? And that's very important, because in linguistic classrooms, we have very similar rubrics which say, the information should be relevant. However, we don't necessarily clarify what relevant means, or what, as we'll see further on, whatever other adjectives we use, or adverbs, we don't necessarily define them. So L2 proficiency assessment is sort of different from what the linguistic classroom might be trying to achieve or assess, but the standards of rigor should be the same. And this is not achievable for small-scale assessment just because there's no opportunity for us to do large-scale experimentation validation, in the sense that, for example, Evelina Golitsy does in her research on design of rubric for speaking and writing. But the precision and specificity of the rubrics leaves little room for ambiguity, and that should be the case in any linguistic classroom, or at least ideally. Now, here is one of the worst rubrics I've seen. An A student writes critical and thoughtful papers in polished and sophisticated English with no weaknesses in argumentation, coherence, paragraphing, grammar, or syntax, substantiates observations with convincing evidence, and is able to think creatively. And that is essentially, and it follows, I ought not read read the other 3 paragraphs. You get the gist. There is no clarification what is sophisticated English. For some teachers it is one thing, for the other teachers it is absolutely a different thing, right? So I've seen teachers who require British spelling even in the US just because they want to do so, right? When there is no explanation or clarification of these terms, what the assessment becomes is, again, pretty much random number assignment, or rather student random number assignment. I use it in loose terms, not in mathematical rigorous ones. But you see what I mean. If I give 3 different teachers this rubric, they will assign drastically different grades, as has been shown again and again empirically. So that is not a conjecture on my part, right? Now, a different rubric, which is a little bit better, but still quite lacking. And this is the last rubric I'll consider, then I'm wrapping up. This is a rubric for the so-called review paper, which is popular in linguistic classroom, right? So when a student is asked to read a paper and then write a reflection. And so in this particular case, the student is asked to write an introduction and background to the paper they read, then summarize it, then respond in some way, and then they also assessed on form, structure, and style. The problem here is the points, it is never clarified, thank you, it is never clarified whether the points, how to assign points between 0 and 4 and what are the deductions for. And so then we have this pretty much random number assignment between 0 and 4. You know, for something we take away a point, for some we take away 4 points. And that is, again, not a fair assessment if the scores will not be reliable. And that is problematic. So now my suggestion is to begin with designing the assessment. There should be a clear statement of what it is that is being assessed. And surprisingly, this lies at the core of the rubric. Let's consider a review reflection type. Students assign the paper and write the reflections. And so depending on the specific purpose the teacher chooses, the sketch of assessment could look like this. Several subscales, format and language, but it's generally not a very good thing to assess something you're not teaching. And I'm not sure all of us are teaching format and language, citation styles and so on. Thank you. Give me 30 seconds. Literature, empirical methods, statistical methods, and hypothetical study. You assess those subscales. And format and language, 0 for citations. The grammar, if the citations are not proper, then grammar, the register, formal, not informal, ignoring grammatical diversity, as it usually is in a linguistic classroom, or at least, you know, some of the conservative ones. Literature, 0 if relevant, previous literature is not summarized, 1 summary is incomplete, 2 summary is complete, but you need to state what is this completeness of summary, what you mean by summary is complete, how many sentences it should be, what it should include, etc., etc., etc. So you should give the students specific criteria and their definition, not just example, this is very important, not just example, but specific criteria. Same for the statistical methods if you're teaching those. If you're not teaching those, don't assess them. And that is all I have. There are the references. For the I didn't go into much detail, but please ask. I will be glad to elaborate more. Thank you.